The wagon lurched to a stop, and Nora Blaine didn't move. She sat on the splintered bench seat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at what was supposed to be her future. The homestead looked like something that had given up years ago. The cabin leaned slightly to the left, its porch sagging under the weight of rotted wood. The barn had a hole in the roof big enough to see sky through. Fence posts tilted at drunken angles, and the corral gate hung on one hinge, swinging slow in the wind. This was it. This was what her uncle had traded her for. Not even traded, sold. Like a bad horse, like something that needed to be gotten rid of before it became a problem. The driver, a wiry man named Chet, who hadn't said more than 10 words the entire 2-day trip, cleared his throat. "This is the place." Nora didn't answer. She was still looking at the cabin, at the way the door didn't quite sit flush in the frame, at the chimney that looked like one good windstorm would knock it clean off. "You want help with your bag?" Chet asked. "No." She climbed down on her own, her boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. The air smelled like dust and pine and something sour she couldn't name. Her single canvas bag landed beside her a second later, and Chet was already turning the wagon around. "Good luck, miss," he said, and he didn't sound like he meant it. Nora watched him go. The wagon disappeared around the bend, and the silence that followed was so thick it felt like something alive. She picked up her bag and walked toward the cabin, her eyes scanning everything. The broken wheelbarrow lying on its side, the stack of firewood that had gone gray with age, the garden plot choked with weeds. The door opened before she reached it. The man who stepped out was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His hair was dark and needed cutting, his jaw rough with stubble, and his eyes, gray, flat, exhausted, settled on her with all the warmth of a stranger sizing up a stray dog. Reed Calloway, her husband. They'd been married 3 days ago in a ceremony that lasted less than 5 minutes. A judge, 2 witnesses pulled off the street, and a piece of paper that made it legal. Reed had signed without looking at her. She'd done the same. Now he stood in the doorway of his falling down house, and neither of them said a word. Finally, Reed stepped aside. "You can put your things inside." Nora walked past him into the cabin, and the first thing that hit her was the cold. It was late September, and the temperature outside was still decent, but inside it felt like winter had already moved in. The floor was bare wood, uneven and splintered. There was a table, 2 chairs, a stove that looked older than she was, and a narrow bed shoved against the far wall. One bed. Reed must have seen her looking because he said, "I'll sleep in the barn." "You don't have to do that." "I'm doing it." His voice was flat, final. He wasn't being kind. He just didn't want her any closer than necessary. Nora set her bag down on the table. "Where's the well?" "Out back. Pump's broken. You'll have to haul from the creek until I fix it." "How far's the creek?" "Quarter mile." She nodded slowly. "Quarter mile. Twice a day? Maybe more. Add that to the list." Reed moved toward the door, his hand already on the frame like he couldn't get out fast enough. "There's beans in this pot. Help yourself." "Wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. Nora kept her voice even. "I need to know what I'm walking into." Reed's shoulders tensed. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he turned, and the look on his face was something close to anger, but deeper, resigned. "You're walking into a mess," he said. "The land's mortgaged, the cattle are almost gone. The contract I signed 3 years ago is bleeding me dry, and the man who holds it wants me to fail." He paused, his jaw working. "You want the truth? You shouldn't have come here. This place is dying, and I can't stop it." Nora held his gaze. "Then why'd you agree to marry me?" Reed's laugh was short, bitter. "Because Silas Drummond told me if I didn't, he'd call the loan and take everything by winter. He said a wife might make me more stable, might make me work harder." His mouth twisted. He didn't care who, just needed a name on paper. "So I'm a condition of your debt." "That's about right." Nora absorbed that, her face still, her hands loose at her sides. She'd known it wasn't a love match. She'd known her uncle had made some kind of deal to get rid of her after her father died and left her with nothing. But hearing it laid out like this, cold, transactional, brutal, was different. Reed was watching her, waiting for her to cry or yell or collapse. She did none of those things. All right, she said. Reed blinked. All right. You told me the situation. Now I know. She looked around the cabin again, taking stock. How much do we owe? $200, due in 6 months. And how much do we have? 12. Nora nodded once, slow. Then we better get to work. Reed stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. You're not listening. We can't make 200 in 6 months, not with what's left. Maybe you couldn't, Nora said, but you didn't have me before. Something flickered in Reed's expression. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief. He opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Reed turned and walked out without another word. Nora didn't sleep that night. She lay on the narrow bed, wrapped in a thin blanket that smelled like mildew, and stared at the ceiling. The wind rattled the walls. Somewhere outside, a shutter banged loose, over and over, a rhythmless percussion that made her teeth ache. She thought about her uncle's face when he told her she was leaving. The way he'd smiled, small and satisfied, like he'd just solved a problem that had been nagging him for months. You'll do fine out there, Nora. Fresh start. New life. He hadn't even looked sorry. She thought about the judge who'd married her to Reed, the way he'd glanced at her like she was already a ghost. She thought about Reed's voice in the cabin, flat, tired, done. And then she thought about Silas Drummond. She didn't know him yet, not really, but she knew his type. Men like him didn't win by being smarter or stronger. They won by being patient, by setting traps and waiting for people to stumble into them, by making you think you'd failed before you'd even started. Nora sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. She wasn't going to stumble. Morning came cold and gray. Nora was up before the sun, pulling on her boots and stepping outside into air that bit at her skin. The sky was the color of old iron, and frost clung to the grass in thin white patches. Reed was already awake, standing by the barn with his hands shoved in his pockets, staring at the broken fence like it had personally offended him. Nora walked over. What needs doing first? Reed glanced at her, then away. Fence. Cattle keep getting out. You have tools. Some. Then let's start. Reed looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded toward the barn. Hammer and nails are inside. Wires in the back. They worked in silence. Reed pulled the old fence posts while Nora sorted through the wire, untangling the mess of rust and rot. Her hands were cold, her fingers clumsy, but she didn't stop. When Reed set a new post, she held it steady while he drove it into the ground. When he ran out of nails, she fetched more. By midday, they'd repaired 20 feet of fence. It wasn't much, but it was something. Reed straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. He looked at the fence, then at Nora, and for the first time, something that wasn't exhaustion crossed his face. You always work like this? He asked. Like what? Like you're trying to prove something. Nora pulled off her gloves, shaking out her hands. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just trying not to freeze or starve. Reed's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. Fair enough, he said. 3 days later, a man came riding up the road. Nora saw him from the garden, where she'd been pulling weeds for the past hour. He was tall, well-dressed, and riding a horse that looked like it cost more than the entire homestead. His hat was clean, his coat pressed, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Reed came out of the barn, his face going hard the moment he saw the rider. The man dismounted, slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. Reed, he said, his voice smooth. Good to see you. Drummond. Reed's tone was ice. So this was Silas Drummond. Nora set down her bucket and walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. Drummond's eyes flicked to her, assessing, curious. And you must be the new Mrs. Calloway, he said. Nora, is it? That's right. Drummond's smile widened. Pleasure. I'm Silas Drummond. I hold the contract on this land. He looked around, taking in the cabin, the patched fence, the sorry state of everything. I have to say I'm impressed. Most women wouldn't last a week out here. I'm not most women. Clearly. He turned back to Reed. I came to check in, see how you're managing. We're managing fine, Reed said. Are you? Drummond's tone was light, but there was something sharp underneath. Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like much has changed. Fence is still falling apart, barn's still half collapsed, and I don't see any cattle. We've got cattle. How many? Reed didn't answer. Drummond nodded slowly, like Reed had just confirmed something he already knew. I want you to succeed, Reed. I really do. But the contract's the contract. 6 months, $200. If you can't make it, we'll make it, Nora cut in. Drummond looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. His eyes went cold, calculating. I hope so, he said. I truly do. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. I'll check in again soon. They watched him ride away. When he was gone, Reed turned to Nora, his face tight. You shouldn't have said that. Said what? That we'll make it. You don't know that. No, Nora agreed, but neither does he. Reed stared at her, and for the first time she saw something like respect flicker in his eyes. Winter came early that year. By October, frost was a permanent feature, and by mid-November the first snow fell. Thick, heavy, relentless. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in the bucket froze overnight, and Nora woke one morning to find ice crusted on the inside of the window. Reed had warned her it would be bad, but knowing it and living it were two different things. The cabin was drafty, the stove barely enough to keep one room warm. Nora stuffed rags into the gaps in the walls and hung blankets over the windows, but the cold still crept in, settling into her bones. They worked anyway. Reed chopped wood until his hands bled. Nora patched the barn roof, standing on a ladder in the freezing wind, hammering down shingles that cracked under her fingers. They moved the cattle closer to the barn, rationing the hay they had left. It wasn't enough. One night, Reed came in from the barn with his face gray and his shoulders slumped. We lost one, he said. Nora looked up from the stove. Which one? The red heifer. Found her this morning. Nora's chest tightened. That was one less cow they could sell. One less chance at making the payment. Reed sat down heavily at the table, his head in his hands. We're not going to make it. Nora set down the spoon she'd been holding. Yes, we are. Nora, we are. Her voice was firm. We've still got 5 head. We can sell 2 in the spring, keep 3 for breeding. We can plant early, sell vegetables in town. We can... It won't be enough! Reed's voice cracked, raw. You don't understand. Drummond doesn't want the money. He wants the land. He's been doing this for years, locking people into contracts they can't pay, then taking everything when they fail. That's the game. Nora sat down across from him. Then we change the game. Reed looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. How? I don't know yet, Nora admitted, but I will. Reed held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, something in his expression shifted. Not hope, not yet, but something close. All right, he said quietly. All right. Doc, 2 weeks before Christmas, Nora rode into town. The settlement wasn't much. A general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of houses scattered along a muddy road. She tied her horse outside the store and stepped inside, shaking snow off her coat. The clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, looked up. Help you? I need to see the land office records. The clerk frowned. What for? I want to know who holds the contracts in this valley. That's public record, but it'll cost you. Nora pulled a coin from her pocket and set it on the counter. The clerk took it, then led her to a back room where dusty ledgers were stacked on shelves. You got a specific name? Silas Drummond. The clerk's expression flickered, surprise, maybe wariness. You sure about that? I'm sure. He pulled down a ledger and set it on the table. Good luck. Nora opened it and started reading. It took her an hour to piece it together, but when she did, the shape of it was clear. Drummond didn't just hold Reed's contract, he held 9 others, all within a 20-mile radius. All structured the same way. High interest, short terms, impossible payments. And in the past 3 years, he'd foreclosed on 5 of them. Nora sat back, her jaw tight. It wasn't about the money, it was about the land. Drummond was building an empire, one foreclosure at a time, and Reed was just the next piece. When Nora got back to the homestead, Reed was in the barn, mending a harness. She told him what she'd found. Reed listened, his hands going still. When she finished, he set down the leather and looked at her, his face unreadable. "So what do we do?" he asked. Nora met his eyes. "We stop playing his game." "And how do we do that?" "We find proof, real proof, contracts, ledgers, anything that shows what he's doing. And then we take it to someone who can stop him." Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's dangerous." "I know. He'll come after us." "I know that too." Reed studied her, and Nora saw the shift happen. The moment he stopped seeing her as a stranger who'd been dumped on his doorstep and started seeing her as a partner. "All right," he said. "Then we do it together." Nora nodded. "Together." They started planning that night. Drummond kept his records in his house, a large, well-maintained place on the edge of town. He had a housekeeper who left at sundown and a foreman who stayed in the bunkhouse out back. If they were going to get in, it would have to be at night, and it would have to be soon. Reed drew a rough map of the property from memory. His office is on the second floor east side. That's where he keeps everything locked up. "Can you pick a lock?" Nora asked. Reed gave her a look. "Can you?" "I can learn." They practiced on the cabin door using a bent nail and a thin piece of wire. It took Nora 45 minutes to get it open the first time, but by the end of the night she had it down to 3. Reed watched, shaking his head. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "I didn't, I just figured it out." Reed laughed, short, surprised. "You're something else, you know that?" Nora didn't answer, but something warm flickered in her chest. They decided to go on a Saturday night when Drummond would be at the saloon. The plan was simple. Get in, find the contracts, get out. No noise, no mistakes. Nora dressed in dark clothes, her hair tied back. Reed did the same. They rode into town just after midnight, leaving their horses a quarter mile out and approaching the house on foot. The street was empty, the windows dark. Reed led the way around the back, where a low fence bordered the property. They climbed over, moving slow and quiet, and crossed the yard to the side door. Nora pulled out the wire and bent nail, her hand steady despite the pounding in her chest. The lock clicked open on the second try. They slipped inside. The house was cold and silent. Nora's eyes adjusted to the darkness, picking out the shape of furniture, the outline of a staircase. Reed touched her arm, pointing up. They climbed the stairs, each step careful, deliberate. At the top, Reed turned left, leading her down a narrow hallway to a door at the end. Nora tried the handle. Locked. She knelt, working the wire into the mechanism. This lock was tougher, older. Sweat prickled at her neck as she twisted and probed, feeling for the catch. Finally, it gave. The door swung open, and they stepped into Drummond's office. Moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating a heavy desk, filing cabinets, shelves lined with ledgers. Reed went to the desk. Nora started on the cabinets. She found the contracts in the second drawer, dozens of them, all signed, all with Drummond's name at the top. She pulled them out, scanning the terms, the dates, the signatures, and then she found something else. A folder tucked in the back, marked private. Nora opened it. Inside were letters, correspondence between Drummond and a judge named Horace Tinsley. The language was careful, coded, but the meaning was clear. Tinsley was ruling in Drummond's favor in exchange for a cut of the foreclosed properties. Nora's hand shook as she read. This was it. This was the proof. "Reed," she whispered. He looked up. She held out the folder. Reed's eyes widened as he skimmed the letters. Jesus. "We need to take this. If he finds out, he won't. Not until it's too late." Reed hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's go." They repacked everything, leaving the office exactly as they'd found it, and slipped back into the hallway. That's when they heard the door downstairs open. Nora froze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming toward the stairs. Reed grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the office. They pressed against the wall, barely breathing. The footsteps climbed the stairs, one at a time. Nora's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The footsteps stopped. A long silence. Then they started again, moving away, down the hall toward another room. Reed pointed to the window. Nora nodded. They crossed to it, and Reed eased it open. The drop was 10 feet, maybe more, onto hard ground. Reed went first, lowering himself down and landing with a soft thud. Nora followed, her hand slipping on the sill. She hit the ground harder than she meant to, pain shooting up her ankle. Reed caught her arm, steadying her. They ran. Behind them, a light flared in the upstairs window. They didn't stop. They ran through the yard, over the fence, across the open ground to where the horses waited. Nora's ankle screamed with every step, but she didn't slow down. They mounted and rode hard, the night swallowing them whole. It wasn't until they were miles away, the town a distant glow behind them, that Reed pulled up. Nora stopped beside him, gasping, her hands shaking. Reed looked at her, his face pale in the moonlight. "We did it." Nora nodded, clutching the folder against her chest. "We did." But as they rode back toward the homestead, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just set something in motion, something bigger and more dangerous than either of them had imagined. And there was no going back now. The folder sat on the table between them like a live thing, dangerous and humming with possibility. Nora's hands were still shaking from the ride back, her ankle throbbing where she'd landed wrong, but she couldn't look away from those letters. Reed stood by the stove, pouring coffee that neither of them would drink, his jaw tight. "We need to figure out what we're doing with this," he said finally. "We take it to Denver, to the territorial prosecutor." Reed turned, his eyes sharp. "That's 2 days' ride in good weather. It's December, Nora. The pass could close any day now." "Then we go before it does. And what happens when Drummond figures out someone broke into his house? You think he won't come looking?" Nora met his gaze. "I think he already knows something's wrong. We weren't quiet leaving." Reed set the coffee pot down hard enough that it rattled. "Then we're already in it." "We were always in it," Nora said. "The only difference is now we have a way out." Reed ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, to tell her this was insane, that they should burn the folder and pretend they'd never seen it. But he didn't. Instead, he said, "All right, when do we leave?" "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Reed's voice cracked. "Nora, we need supplies. We need to move before Drummond figures out what we took." She stood, ignoring the spike of pain in her ankle. "We pack tonight. We leave at first light." Reed stared at her, something shifting in his expression. Not quite admiration, but close. "You don't do anything halfway, do you?" "Haven't had the luxury." He nodded slowly. "All right. I'll get the horses ready. You pack food, blankets, anything we can carry." They worked through the night. Nora wrapped bread and dried meat in cloth, filled canteens, rolled blankets tight. Her ankle screamed every time she put weight on it, but she kept moving. Reed checked the saddles, redistributed their gear, made sure the rifles were loaded. By the time the sky started to lighten, they were ready. Nora stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking back at the table, the stove, the narrow bed she'd slept in for the past 2 months. It wasn't much. It wasn't even hers, not really. But it was the first place in a long time that had felt like something worth fighting for. "You ready?" Reed asked from behind her. Nora turned. "Yeah." They rode out as the sun broke over the mountains, the folder wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside Reed's saddlebag. The first day was cold but clear. They followed the road north, keeping a steady pace, stopping only to rest the horses. Reed didn't talk much, and Nora didn't push. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking to the horizon like he expected Drummond to come riding over the ridge any second. By nightfall, they'd covered nearly 30 miles. They made camp in a stand of pines, building a small fire that Reed kept low and smokeless. Nora sat on a fallen log, unwrapping the last of the bread, and watched Reed check the perimeter for the 3rd time. "He's not coming tonight," she said. Reed looked back at her. "You don't know that." "No, but worrying about it won't change anything." Reed sat down across from her, his face half in shadow. "You're not scared, are you?" Nora thought about that. "I'm scared. I'm just not letting it stop me." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where'd you learn to be like this?" "Like what?" "Stubborn as hell." Nora smiled faintly. "My father, he was a carpenter, used to say the only thing worse than failing was not trying because you were afraid to fail." She looked down at her hands. "He died when I was 16. Fell off a roof. After that, it was just me and my uncle didn't want me around, so I learned to take care of myself." Reed nodded slowly. "My father was a drunk. Lost our farm when I was 12. After that, I swore I'd never let anyone take land from me again." He laughed, bitter. "Look how that turned out." "It's not over yet." "No," Reed agreed. "Not yet." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. And for the first time since Nora had stepped off that wagon, she didn't feel like a stranger sitting across from him. The second day was harder. The temperature dropped and the sky turned the color of old slate. By midday, snow started to fall, light at first, then heavier, the flakes thick and wet. The road became slick, the horses skittish. Nora's ankle ached worse with every mile, but she kept her mouth shut. They were still 10 miles from the pass when Reed pulled up. "We need to find shelter," he said. "If this keeps up, we won't make it through." Nora looked around. There was nothing but open ground and scattered trees. "Where?" Reed pointed east. "There's an old line shack about a mile off the road. It's not much, but it'll keep us out of the wind." They found it just as the light started to fade, a small, sagging structure with a door that hung crooked and gaps in the roof wide enough to see through. But it had 4 walls and a stone fireplace, and that was enough. Reed got a fire going while Nora unsaddled the horses and tied them under a lean-to that looked like it might collapse any second. By the time she limped back inside, the shack was warm enough to breathe without seeing her breath. Reed looked up from where he was spreading out their blankets. "How's your ankle?" "Fine." "Nora." "Ma, I said it's fine." Reed stood and walked over, his face set. "Sit down." "Reed?" "Sit. Down." Nora sat. Reed knelt in front of her and pulled off her boot before she could stop him. Her ankle was swollen, mottled with bruises, the skin tight and hot. Reed exhaled through his teeth. "You should have said something. It doesn't matter." "It does if you can't walk." "I can walk." Reed looked up at her, his eyes hard. "You're going to break it if you keep pushing like this." "Then I'll break it." For a moment, Reed just stared at her. Then he shook his head, almost smiling. "You really don't quit, do you?" "No." He wrapped her ankle in a strip of cloth, tight enough to support it, but not so tight it cut off circulation. When he was done, he sat back on his heels. "We rest here tonight. Tomorrow we see how bad the pass is." Nora nodded. That night the wind howled outside, shaking the walls, and snow piled up against the door. Nora lay on her blanket near the fire, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm. Reed was on the other side of the fire, his back against the wall, his rifle across his lap. "You think we'll make it?" Nora asked. Reed didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I think if anyone can, it's you." Nora turned her head to look at him. "Not me. Us." Reed's mouth twitched. "Yeah. Us." They reached Denver 2 days later, half frozen and exhausted. The city was bigger than anything Nora had ever seen. Buildings 3 stories tall, streets crowded with wagons and people, the air thick with smoke and noise. Reed led the way to the courthouse, a solid brick structure on the corner of a busy intersection. Inside, a clerk sat behind a high desk, scribbling in a ledger. Reed stepped up. "We need to see the territorial prosecutor." The clerk didn't look up. "He's busy." "It's important. Everyone says that." Reed pulled the folder from his saddlebag and dropped it on the desk. "Tell him it's about a judge taking bribes and a land fraud scheme operating out of the San Luis Valley." The clerk finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. He opened the folder, scanned the first letter, and his face went pale. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared through a door behind him. 5 minutes later, they were sitting in a narrow office across from a man named Samuel Gorman, territorial prosecutor, late 40s, with sharp eyes and a mouth that looked like it didn't smile often. Gorman read through the folder in silence, his expression getting darker with every page. When he finished, he set it down and looked at them. "Where did you get this?" Does it matter? Nora asked. It might. We found it in Silas Drummond's office, Reed said. He's been running a scheme for years, trapping people in bad contracts, then foreclosing when they can't pay. Judge Tinsley's been helping him. Gorman leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. And you broke into Drummond's house to get this? Yes. That makes it inadmissible in court. Nora's chest tightened. What? Evidence obtained illegally can't be used in a trial. Any lawyer worth his salt will get it thrown out. Reed's jaw clenched. So we risked our lives for nothing. I didn't say that. Gorman picked up one of the letters, studying it. What I said is it can't be used in court, but it can be used to open an investigation. If I can get testimony from the other people Drummond's defrauded, if I can find independent evidence of the scheme, then we have a case. How long will that take? Nora asked. Months. Maybe longer. We don't have months. Drummond's payment is due in 4. Gorman looked at her, and for the first time, something like sympathy crossed his face. Then you better hope I work fast. They left the courthouse with nothing but Gorman's word that he'd look into it. It didn't feel like enough. Reed was quiet on the ride back, his face set, his hands tight on the reins. Nora didn't try to talk to him. She didn't know what to say. They camped that night in the same line shack, and Nora lay awake staring at the fire, her mind turning over everything Gorman had said. Months. Maybe longer. They didn't have that kind of time. We need another plan, she said into the darkness. Reed shifted. What kind of plan? I don't know yet, but we can't just sit around waiting for Gorman to build a case. Drummond's going to figure out we're the ones who broke in, and when he does, he'll come after us. Exactly. Reed sat up, his silhouette sharp against the firelight. So what do you want to do? Nora thought about it. Then she said, we go back. We talk to the other people Drummond screwed over. We get them to come forward. If Gorman has witnesses, he can move faster. Reed was quiet for a long moment. You're talking about convincing people to go up against the man who owns half the valley. People who are already scared. I'm talking about giving them a reason not to be. Reed exhaled, slow and deliberate. All right, then we start tomorrow. The next week, they rode to every homestead on Gorman's list. Some people slammed the door in their faces. Others listened but wouldn't commit. A few were angry, furious that Nora and Reed had stirred up trouble that might come back on all of them. But some agreed. A widow named Alma Pritchard, who'd lost her land 2 years ago and was still working as a cook in town just to survive. A young couple, the Harrisons, who were 3 months from foreclosure and desperate enough to try anything. A man named Tom Birch, who'd watched Drummond take his neighbor's farm and knew he was next. One by one, they signed statements. One by one, they agreed to testify. By the time Nora and Reed rode back to their homestead, they had 6 witnesses. It still didn't feel like enough, but it was a start. The day they got back, there was a man waiting on their porch. He was young, maybe 25, with a thin face and nervous hands. He stood when he saw them, his hat in his hands. Mr. Calloway, he said. Mrs. Calloway? Reed dismounted slowly, his eyes wary. Who's asking? My name's Jacob Lowe. I work for Mr. Drummond. Nora's hand went to the rifle on her saddle. Jacob saw the movement and raised his hands. I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to talk to you. Reed's voice was flat. About what? Jacob glanced around like he was afraid someone might be listening. About what you took from Mr. Drummond's office. Nora and Reed exchanged a look. Jacob hurried on. I know what he's been doing. I've been keeping his books for 2 years, and I know how the scheme works, and I want to help you stop him. Reed stepped closer, his eyes hard. Why? Jacob's jaw tightened. Because my brother was one of the people he foreclosed on. He lost everything. Couldn't take it. Jacob's voice broke. He hung himself last spring, and Drummond didn't even blink. Nora felt something tighten in her chest. Reed studied Jacob for a long moment. Then he said, What do you have? Jacob reached into his coat and pulled out a small ledger. Copies of the contracts, payment records, letters between Drummond and the judge. Everything you need to prove what he's been doing. Nora took the ledger, flipping through it. The numbers were all there. Payments that didn't match the terms, interest rates that doubled overnight, foreclosures processed before the contracts were even due. It was everything Gorman needed. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Nora asked. Jacob looked down. "I was scared. Drummond's got connections everywhere. I didn't think anyone would believe me." He looked up, his eyes red. "But when I heard what you did, breaking into his house, taking those letters, I figured if you were brave enough to do that, maybe I could be brave enough to help." Reed glanced at Nora. She nodded. "All right," Reed said. "We'll take it to the prosecutor. But if you're lying to us—" "I'm not," Jacob said quickly. "I swear." Nora believed him. They rode to Denver again the next day, this time with Jacob and the ledger. Gorman's face when he saw the records was something close to vindication. "This is it," he said, spreading the pages across his desk. "This is what I need." "How long?" Reed asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'll file charges, get a warrant for Drummond's arrest, freeze his assets. Once that happens, the contracts are void." Nora leaned forward. "And the people he foreclosed on?" "If I can prove the contracts were fraudulent, they'll get their land back." For the first time in months, Nora felt something like hope. But Gorman's expression darkened. "You need to understand, Drummond's not going to go quietly, and until I get that warrant, he's still a free man. If he figures out what's happening, he'll come after us," Nora finished. Gorman nodded. "You should stay in Denver until this is over." Reed shook his head. "We've got cattle to feed, land to work. We're not running." Gorman looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. "Then be careful." They rode back to the homestead under a sky heavy with clouds. The snow had started again, light and steady, and the temperature was dropping fast. Nora's ankles still ached, but it was healing. Reed had been quieter than usual, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. "You all right?" Nora asked. Reed didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I keep thinking about what happens if this doesn't work." "It'll work." "You don't know that." "No," Nora admitted, "but I know we did everything we could." Reed glanced at her. "You really believe that?" "I have to." Reed nodded slowly. Then he said, "You know, when you first showed up, I thought you'd be gone in a month. Thought you'd take one look at this place and run." "I thought about it," Nora said honestly. "That first night, lying in that freezing cabin, I thought about leaving." "Why didn't you?" Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I was tired of running, and because I figured if I was going to fight for something, it might as well be this." Reed looked at her, something shifting in his expression. "I'm glad you stayed." Nora's chest tightened. "Yeah, me too." They got back to the homestead just as the sun was setting. The cabin looked the same, small, crooked, half falling apart. But when Nora stepped inside and felt the warmth from the stove, smelled the faint scent of wood smoke and coffee, it felt like coming home. Reed lit the lamp while Nora started dinner. They ate in silence, the exhaustion of the past 2 weeks catching up with them. After dinner, Reed stood by the window, looking out at the snow. "You think Drummond knows?" he asked. Nora didn't answer right away. Then she said, "If he doesn't, he will soon." Reed nodded. "Then we need to be ready." That night, Nora dreamed about the homestead burning. She woke in the dark, her heart pounding, the smell of smoke so real she could taste it. But when she sat up, the cabin was quiet, the stove cold. Reed was sitting at the table, the rifle across his lap, staring at the door. "You see something?" Nora asked. Reed shook his head. "No, just can't sleep." Nora got up and sat across from him. "We're going to be all right." Reed looked at her, his face drawn. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come here." "You would have figured it out." "No," Reed said. "I wouldn't have. I was done, Nora. I'd given up. And then you showed up and refused to quit. And it made me remember what it felt like to fight for something." Nora felt something catch in her throat. "Reed." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you." Nora squeezed his hand, her chest tight. "We're not done yet." "I know." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped across the table, the silence between them comfortable and solid. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Nora let herself believe they might actually win. 3 days later, Drummond came. Nora was in the barn mucking out stalls when she heard the horses. She looked up, her hands tightening on the pitchfork, and saw them through the gap in the boards. 6 riders, moving slow and deliberate up the road. Drummond was in front. Nora dropped the pitchfork and ran. Reed was at the cabin, chopping wood. He looked up when he saw her, his face going hard. "Drummond?" Nora said. Reed set down the axe and grabbed the rifle from inside the door. "Stay behind me." Nora ignored him, standing at his side as the riders pulled up in front of the cabin. Drummond dismounted, slow and easy, his face calm. But there was something cold in his eyes, something sharp. "Reed," he said. "Nora." Reed's voice was flat. "What do you want?" Drummond smiled. "I think you know."
"We don't have anything of yours. Don't you?" Drummond's smile widened. "See, that's funny, because a few weeks ago someone broke into my house and stole some very important documents, and I have a feeling it was you." Reed didn't flinch. "You can't prove that." "Maybe not, but I can make your life very difficult while I try." Drummond looked around, taking in the cabin, the barn, the fences. "You've done some nice work here. Be a shame if something happened to it." Nora stepped forward. "You threatening us?" Drummond's eyes flicked to her, and the coldness in them made her skin crawl. "I'm just saying accidents happen. Fires, broken fences, cattle wandering off." He paused. "People getting hurt." Reed raised the rifle. "Get off my land!" Drummond didn't move. "You're making a mistake, Reed. You can't win this. All you're doing is making it worse for yourself." "I said get off my land!" For a long moment, Drummond just stared at him. Then he turned and mounted his horse. "You've got until the end of the month to pay what you owe. After that, this place is mine." He rode off, his men following. Nora and Reed stood in the yard, watching them go. When they were out of sight, Reed lowered the rifle, his hands shaking. "He knows," Nora said. "Yeah. What do we do?" Reed looked at her, his face grim. "We finish it." That night, Reed didn't sleep in the barn. He dragged a chair to the window and sat there with the rifle across his knees, watching the darkness like he expected Drummond's men to come riding back any minute. Nora lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through scenarios that all ended badly. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up pretending and sat up. "You should rest," she said. Reed didn't turn around. "Can't. You're no good to either of us exhausted. I'm no good to either of us dead." His voice was rough, worn down to nothing. "If they come back, they won't. Not tonight." Nora stood and walked over to him. "Drummond's not stupid. He wants us scared, wants us making mistakes. Coming back tonight would be too obvious." Reed finally looked at her, his eyes bloodshot. "You sound pretty sure about that." "I'm not sure about anything, but sitting here waiting for something that might not happen isn't helping." She put her hand on his shoulder. "Come on, get a few hours. I'll watch." Reed hesitated, then stood, his body stiff from sitting so long. "Wake me if you hear anything." "I will." He lay down on the bed without taking off his boots, the rifle next to him. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out. Not quite sleep, but close enough. Nora took his place at the window. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough light to see by. The yard was dark, the barn a hulking shadow against the sky. Every sound made her jump. The wind rattling the shutters, an animal moving through the brush, the settling of old wood. She thought about Drummond's face when he'd made his threat. The casual way he'd talked about fires and accidents, like he was discussing the weather. Men like him didn't make empty threats. They made promises. Dawn came slowly, the sky turning from black to gray to pale yellow. Reed woke when the first light hit his face. He sat up, blinking, and looked at Nora still standing by the window. "You didn't wake me," he said.
"Nothing to wake you for." He rubbed his face with both hands. "We need to talk to Gorman. Tell him what happened." "And say what? That Drummond threatened us? He'll tell us to be careful and keep working on the case." Nora turned from the window. "We already know that." "So what do you want to do?" Nora had been thinking about that all night. "We go on the offensive. Stop waiting for him to make the next move." Reed stood, crossing to where she was. "What does that look like?" We get the witnesses to Denver, all of them, together. We make Gorman move faster. If we can get the warrant issued before the end of the month, Drummond can't touch the land. That's 2 weeks away. I know. Reed studied her face. You think they'll come, the witnesses? I think they're as scared as we are. And I think if we don't give them something to believe in, they're going to fold. Reed nodded slowly. All right, then we start today. They split up. Reed took the northern homesteads, the Harrisons, Tom Birch, a widow named Sarah Mackenzie who'd lost her husband and her farm in the same year. Nora took the southern ones, Alma Pritchard, a man named Frank Carver whose hands shook when he talked, and a young woman named Beth Riley who'd been trying to run her family's ranch alone since her father died. Nora found Beth first, standing in a corral trying to separate a calf from its mother. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, thin and sun-browned, with dark hair tied back in a braid that had come half undone. Beth Riley, Nora called. The girl looked up, her face wary. Who's asking? Nora Calloway. We met a few weeks back. Recognition flickered. Right, the woman going after Drummond. Beth climbed over the fence, wiping her hands on her pants. What do you want? We're taking the witnesses to Denver. This week. I need to know if you're still in. Beth's jaw tightened. I told you I'd testify. But telling me and doing it are different things, especially now that Drummond knows someone's moving against him. He came here, Beth said quietly. 2 days ago, asked if I'd talked to anyone, asked if I knew anything about missing papers. Nora's chest tightened. What did you tell him? That I didn't know what he was talking about, that I was just trying to keep my cows alive. Beth looked down at her hands. He didn't believe me. Did he threaten you? Didn't have to. Just stood there looking at my barn like he was deciding how fast it would burn. Beth's voice cracked. This is all I have left. If he takes it, he won't, Nora cut in. Not if we stop him first, but I need you in Denver. I need all of you together so the prosecutor can't ignore this. Beth looked up, her eyes wet. You really think it'll work? I think it's the only chance we've got. Beth was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right, when do we leave? 2 days. Meet us at the crossroads outside town at dawn. I'll be there. Nora found Alma Pritchard in town, working in the kitchen of the boarding house where she'd been living since Drummond took her land. Alma was in her 50s, solid and steady, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and hands scarred from years of hard work. She looked up when Nora walked in, flour dusting her apron. Mrs. Calloway, she said. Didn't expect to see you. I need to talk to you. Alma glanced at the woman running the kitchen, then wiped her hands and stepped outside into the alley. What's going on? Nora told her. Alma listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When Nora finished, she shook her head. I can't go to Denver, she said. Why not? Because I've got work here. I miss a week. I lose this job. And if I lose this job, I've got nothing. If we win, you get your land back. And if you lose, I'm out of work and still don't have land. Alma's voice was flat. I'm sorry, Mrs. Calloway. I wish I could help, but I can't risk what little I've got left. Nora felt frustration rise in her chest, hot and sharp. You think Drummond's going to stop with us? You think he won't keep doing this to other people? Probably not, but that's not my problem anymore. Yes, it is. As long as men like him can do this and get away with it, it's everyone's problem. Alma looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, You're young. You still think fighting matters, but I've been fighting my whole life, and all it ever got me was tired. She turned to go back inside. I hope you win. I really do. But I can't help you. Nora stood in the alley, her hands clenched, watching Alma disappear into the kitchen. One down. Frank Carver was worse. She found him at his homestead, sitting on the porch with a bottle that was already half empty, despite it being barely noon. He looked up when she rode in, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. I know why you're here, he said before she could speak. And the answer's no. Nora dismounted. You haven't even heard. Don't need to. I'm not going to Denver. I'm not testifying. I'm not doing anything that'll bring Drummond down on me worse than he already is. He's already won if you think like that. Frank laughed, bitter and empty. He already has won. Or haven't you figured that out yet? He took a long drink. You think the law's going to help you? You think some prosecutor in Denver gives a damn about people like us? I think he cares about stopping corruption. Then you're a fool. Frank stood, swaying slightly. Go home, Mrs. Calloway. Take care of your own land and leave the rest of us alone. Nora rode away feeling like she'd been punched in the stomach. 2 witnesses down. If the others backed out, they wouldn't have enough. She met Reed at the crossroads as the sun was setting. He looked as tired as she felt. How'd it go? Alma won't come, Frank either. Reed's face darkened. Damn. You? Tom Birch is in. Sarah Mackenzie, too. The Harrisons said they'd think about it. Reed rubbed his face. We're losing them, Nora. I know. They rode back to the homestead in silence. That night, Nora couldn't eat. She sat at the table, pushing beans around her plate, her mind turning over the problem from every angle. Reed finally set down his fork. Talk to me. We're not going to have enough witnesses. Even if everyone who said yes shows up, it might not be enough to convince Gorman to move fast. So what do? Nora looked up. We make sure it's enough. We go to Denver ourselves tonight, and we tell Gorman what Drummond's doing, threatening witnesses, scaring people off. We make him understand this can't wait. Reed leaned back in his chair. You want to ride to Denver now? In the dark? We'll leave at first light, but we need to go tomorrow, not in 2 days. We can't wait. Reed studied her face, then he nodded. All right, we go tomorrow. They left before dawn, pushing the horses hard. The ride to Denver took a full day, and by the time they reached the city, it was past midnight. The courthouse was dark, locked up tight. They found a cheap boarding house and paid for a room, then waited for morning. Nora lay in the narrow bed, listening to Reed's breathing from where he'd taken the floor, and tried not to think about everything that could still go wrong. Gorman's office didn't open until 8. They were waiting on the steps when the clerk arrived, and they followed him inside before he could tell them to come back later. We need to see Gorman, Reed said. The clerk looked annoyed. He's not in yet. Then we'll wait. They waited. Gorman arrived at 8:30, carrying a stack of papers and looking like he'd already had a long day. He stopped when he saw them. Mr. and Mrs. Calloway, he said. This is unexpected. We need to talk, Nora said. Gorman gestured them into his office. Once the door was closed, Reed laid it out. Drummond's visit, the threats, the witnesses backing out. Gorman listened, his face getting grimmer with every sentence. When Reed finished, he sat back in his chair and exhaled hard. This is exactly what I was afraid of, he said. Then do something about it, Nora said. Issue the warrant now, freeze his assets. If you move fast enough, I can't issue a warrant without sufficient evidence. And right now, all I have is the documents you brought me and a few witness statements. That's not enough for a judge to sign off on. What about Jacob's ledger? It helps, but I need corroboration. I need people willing to stand up in court and say under oath that Drummond defrauded them. And if they're too scared to do that? Gorman's expression softened slightly. Then I understand. But it doesn't change the law. Nora felt the frustration building again, hot and choking. So we're just supposed to wait while Drummond picks us off one by one? I'm doing everything I can, Gorman said, but I can't fabricate evidence. I can't force people to testify. He leaned forward. What I can do is put pressure on Drummond. Make it clear we're investigating him. Sometimes that's enough to make a man slip up. And if it's not, Gorman didn't answer. They left the courthouse feeling like they'd hit a wall. Reed was quiet on the ride back, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. Nora didn't try to fill the silence. There was nothing left to say. They reached the homestead just as the sun was setting. The cabin was still standing. The barn hadn't burned. The cattle were where they'd left them. But Nora couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. 2 days later, Tom Birch showed up at their door. He was alone, his face pale, and he wouldn't meet Reed's eyes. I can't do it, he said. I'm sorry. I wanted to help, but I can't. Reed's voice was flat. What happened?
Drummond's men came by yesterday, didn't touch anything, didn't say much, just stood there looking at my place like they were measuring it for a coffin. Tom's hands shook. I've got a wife, Reed. I've got kids. I can't risk it. Reed nodded slowly. I understand. Tom looked at Nora, his eyes pleading. I'm sorry. It's all right, Nora said, even though it wasn't. They watched him ride away. Reed turned to her. That's 3 witnesses left. The Harrisons, Sarah Mackenzie, and Beth Riley. If any of them back out, they won't, Nora said, but she didn't sound convinced. The next morning, Nora rode out to check on the remaining witnesses herself. She found Sarah Mackenzie first, a woman in her 60s who'd been widowed twice and wore her grief like armor. I'm still in, Sarah said when Nora asked. Drummond took my land. He can threaten me all he wants, but he can't take anything else because I don't have anything else. Nora felt something loosen in her chest. Thank you. Beth Riley was next, and she was just as stubborn. I'm not backing out, she said. My father would have fought, so will I. That left the Harrisons. Nora found them in their cabin, packing. We're leaving, Mary Harrison said when Nora walked in. She was young, maybe 25, with a baby on her hip and exhaustion written all over her face. We can't stay here anymore. Where are you going? Back east. My sister's in Ohio. She said we could stay with her until we get back on our feet. Nora looked at James Harrison, who was standing by the window staring out at nothing. What about the land? Let Drummond have it, James said without turning around. We're done. If you leave, he wins. He's already won. James finally looked at her, and the defeat in his eyes was total. We stayed as long as we could, but we've got a kid to think about now. We can't keep fighting a fight we're never going to win. Nora wanted to argue, wanted to tell them they were wrong, that they could win if they just held on a little longer. But looking at Mary's face, at the way she held her baby like it was the only thing keeping her upright, Nora couldn't find the words. I'm sorry, Mary said quietly. I hope you win, but we can't be part of it anymore. Nora rode back to the homestead feeling like the ground was crumbling under her feet. Reed took the news better than she expected. We still have 3, he said. That'll have to be enough. Will it? It'll have to be. That night, they sat at the table going over everything one more time. The contracts, the letters, Jacob's ledger. Looking for anything they might have missed, any angle they hadn't considered. Nora was reading through one of Drummond's letters to Judge Tinsley when something caught her eye. Wait, she said. Reed looked up. What? This letter. It's dated March 15th. But look at this. She pulled out another letter. This one's dated March 20th, and in the first one, Drummond's talking about foreclosing on the Patterson property, but in the second one, he's already done it. So the contract says the Pattersons had 30 days to pay after the notice was filed, but according to this, Drummond foreclosed 5 days after the notice. Reed leaned forward. That's illegal. Exactly. Nora started pulling out more letters, more contracts, spreading them across the table. What if he did that with other properties? What if we can prove he didn't follow the legal process? They worked through the night. By morning, they'd found 6 cases where Drummond had foreclosed before the legal waiting period was up. 6 properties he'd taken that should have been challenged in court, but weren't, because the people he'd stolen from didn't know the law well enough to fight back. Nora sat back, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. This is it. This is what Gorman needs. Reed looked at the papers spread across the table. You think it's enough? It has to be. They rode to Denver for the 3rd time in as many weeks. Gorman read through the evidence, his expression shifting from interested to intent. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at them. This changes things, he said. How? Nora asked. Because this isn't just fraud. This is theft under color of law. If I can prove Drummond knowingly violated foreclosure procedures, I can bring criminal charges. He tapped the papers. This gives me grounds for a warrant. Reed leaned forward. When? I'll file the motion today. If the judge signs off, and he should, I can have the warrant by end of week. That's still 5 days, Nora said. It's the best I can do. They left Gorman's office with something that felt dangerously close to hope. But 5 days was a long time. The storm hit on the third day. Nora woke to the sound of wind screaming against the cabin walls and snow hammering the roof. She sat up disoriented and saw Reed already at the window. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad." By midday, the snow was coming down so hard she couldn't see the barn from the cabin door. The temperature had dropped until the air itself felt sharp, cutting. "We need to check the cattle," Reed said, pulling on his coat. "I'll come with you." "No, stay here. Keep the fire going." "Reed, I mean it, Nora. If we both get lost out there, we're done." He was right, and she hated it. She watched him disappear into the white, then turned back to the stove and started feeding it wood. An hour passed, then 2. Nora stood at the window, staring into the storm, her chest tight. Reed had said it would take 30 minutes to check on the cattle and get back. He'd been gone twice that. She was about to go after him when the door slammed open. Reed stumbled in, covered in snow, his face gray. He was carrying something, a calf, limp and barely breathing. "Help me," he gasped. They laid the calf by the stove, rubbing it down with blankets, trying to warm it. The animal's breathing was shallow, its eyes half closed. "Where's the mother?" Nora asked. "Dead. Found her in the ravine." This one was lying next to her. Nora felt something twist in her chest. That was another cow gone. Another piece of income they couldn't afford to lose. Reed sat back on his heels, breathing hard. "The others are safe. Got them into the barn, but if this storm doesn't let up, we'll deal with it," Nora said. "Right now, focus on this one." They worked through the night, taking turns keeping the fire going, checking on the calf. By morning, the animal was standing, shaky but alive. The storm broke just after dawn. Reed went out to assess the damage while Nora stayed with the calf. When he came back, his face was grim. Lost part of the barn roof, fences down in 3 places, and we're almost out of hay. Nora closed her eyes. "How much do we have left?" "A week, maybe less if the cattle eat more to stay warm." "Can we buy more?" "Not without money." They stood in the cabin, surrounded by the wreckage of the storm, and Nora felt the weight of it pressing down on her like something physical. 2 more days until Gorman's warrant, if they could just hold on that long. The next morning, Drummond came back. This time he brought more men, 8 of them, all armed. Nora saw them from the cabin window, and her blood went cold. Reed grabbed the rifle and stepped outside. Drummond didn't dismount. He sat on his horse, looking down at Reed with something like satisfaction on his face. "I'll make this simple," Drummond said. "You've got 2 choices. You can leave now, today, and I'll let you walk away. Or you can stay, and when the payment comes due next week, I'll take this land and everything on it." He paused. "Including you, if you're stupid enough to still be here." Reed's voice was steady. "We're not leaving." "Then you're a fool." Drummond looked past Reed to where Nora was standing in the doorway. "Both of you." He turned his horse and rode off, his men following. Nora walked out to stand beside Reed. "He's not going to wait for the payment," she said quietly. "He's going to do something before then." Reed nodded. "I know." That night they took turns on watch again. Nora sat by the window, the rifle across her lap, watching the darkness. Every shadow looked like a man, every sound like footsteps. Around midnight, she smelled smoke. She was on her feet before she'd fully registered it, her heart pounding. "Reed!" He was up in an instant. "Where?" "I don't know." They ran outside. The barn was on fire. Flames were already climbing the walls, bright and hungry in the darkness. Reed ran toward it, and Nora followed, her mind screaming. The cattle. Reed threw open the barn doors and smoke poured out, thick and choking. Inside, the animals were panicking, crashing against the walls. "Get them out!" Reed shouted. Nora ran in, her eyes burning, and grabbed the nearest cow by its halter. The animal fought her, terrified, but she dragged it toward the door. Reed was doing the same, pulling and shoving, trying to get them all out before the roof came down. The heat was unbearable. Nora's lungs burned with every breath. She got 3 cows out, then 4. Reed was still inside. "Reed!" she screamed. He appeared in the doorway, covered in soot, dragging the last cow. They stumbled into the yard just as part of the roof collapsed, sending up a shower of sparks. Nora fell to her knees, coughing so hard she thought her ribs would crack. Reed collapsed beside her. They watched the barn burn, the flames reaching toward the sky like something alive. By the time the fire burned itself out, there was nothing left but charred wood and ash. Nora sat in the dirt, her face black with soot, and felt something break inside her. This was it. This was how Drummond won. Reed put his hand on her shoulder. "We're not done." Nora looked at him. "Reed, the barn's gone. We don't have hay. We don't have shelter for the cattle. We're not done," Reed said again, his voice hard. "Drummond thinks he's won. Let him think that. But in 2 days, Gorman's warrant comes through, and then we finish this." Nora wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to that certainty, but sitting there in the ashes, watching the last of the flames flicker and die, it felt like they were fighting something too big to beat. Still, she nodded. Because what else was there to do? They spent the next day trying to salvage what they could from the ruins. The barn was a total loss, blackened beams jutting up from the foundation like broken teeth, the smell of burned wood so thick it coated the back of Nora's throat. The cattle had survived, but they were spooked, bunched together in the far corner of the corral, their eyes rolling white whenever anyone came near. Reed worked in silence, his face set, pulling nails from charred boards that might still be useful. Nora hauled water from the creek to douse the hot spots still smoldering in the ash. Her hands were blistered, her back screaming, but she didn't stop. Around midday, a rider appeared on the road. Nora's hand went to the rifle leaning against the fence post, but Reed shook his head. "It's Jacob," he said. Jacob Lowe dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face pale and tight. "I heard about the fire. Everyone in town's heard." "Word travels fast," Reed said flatly. "Drummond's men have been talking, saying how accidents happen to people who don't know when to quit." Jacob looked at the burned barn, then back at them. "Is anyone hurt?" "Just the barn, Nora said, "and our chances of making it through winter." Jacob reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in canvas. "It's not much. Some hay from my place. Enough to last your cattle a few days, maybe." Reed stared at him. "You can't afford to give that away." "I can't afford not to. You two are the only ones standing up to Drummond. If you go down, the rest of us don't stand a chance." Jacob set the bundle on the ground. "There's more where this came from if you need it." Nora felt something catch in her throat. "Thank you." Jacob nodded, then mounted his horse. "Warrant's coming through tomorrow, right?" "That's what Gorman said." "Then hold on one more day. That's all you need." He turned his horse toward the road, then looked back. "And watch your backs tonight. Drummond's not done yet." They watched him ride away. Reed picked up the hay bundle, testing its weight. "He's right. This won't last long." "It'll last long enough," Nora said. "One more day." That night, Nora couldn't sit still. She paced the cabin while Reed cleaned the rifle for the third time, checking and rechecking that everything worked. The wound on her ankle, mostly healed now, still ached when she put her full weight on it, a dull reminder of how far they'd come. "You should sleep," Reed said without looking up. "Can't." "Try." Nora stopped pacing and looked at him. "What if Gorman doesn't come through? What if the judge doesn't sign the warrant? Then we figure out something else." "There is nothing else, Reed. The payment's due in 5 days. We don't have the money. We don't have the barn. If Gorman doesn't, he will." Reed set down the rifle and stood. "You've been telling me to believe this whole time. Now I'm telling you. He'll come through." Nora wanted to argue, wanted to list all the ways this could still fall apart. But looking at Reed's face, at the certainty there, she found she couldn't. "All right," she said quietly. "One more day." Reed nodded. "One more day." They took turns sleeping, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, the rifle always in reach. Nora dreamed about fire, about smoke filling her lungs and heat blistering her skin, and the barn collapsing in on itself while she stood outside, unable to move, unable to help. She woke gasping, her shirt soaked with sweat, and found Reed watching her from across the room. "Bad dream?" he asked. "Something like that." He handed her a cup of water. "Sun's almost up." Nora drank, her hands steadier than she expected. Any sign of trouble? No, but that doesn't mean anything. She stood, her body stiff from sleeping in her clothes. I'm going to check the cattle. I'll come with you. They walked out into the pre-dawn gray, their breath misting in the cold air. The cattle were huddled together near what was left of the barn, chewing on the hay Jacob had brought. They looked thin, ribs showing under their hides, but they were alive. Nora counted them twice to be sure. All 5 accounted for. Reed leaned against the fence, his eyes on the horizon. If Gorman comes through today, what's the first thing you're going to do? Nora thought about it. Build a new barn. Reed smiled slightly. That's it? Not celebrate, not rest, just straight back to work? We can celebrate when the work's done. She looked at him. What about you? Reed was quiet for a moment. I'm going to sleep for a week. Nora laughed, surprised at the sound. It felt strange, laughing, like something she'd forgotten how to do. Reed looked at her, something soft crossing his face. You should do that more. Do what? Laugh, smile. You've been so focused on surviving, I don't think I've seen you just be happy. Nora felt her chest tighten. Haven't had much to be happy about. No, Reed agreed. But maybe that'll change. They stood there in the growing light, shoulder to shoulder, and for a moment Nora let herself imagine it. A rebuilt barn, healthy cattle, land that was truly theirs. A future that wasn't just about surviving. It felt fragile, that image, like something that could shatter if she breathed on it too hard. But it was there. By noon, there was still no word from Gorman. Nora tried not to let it worry her, tried to focus on the work that needed doing. She repaired fence posts while Reed started clearing the barn site, salvaging anything that could be reused. But every time she heard a sound from the road, her head snapped up. Nothing. By 3 o'clock, she couldn't stand it anymore. I'm riding to town, she said. See if there's any news. Reed looked up from the pile of nails he was sorting. I'll go with you. Someone needs to stay here. Watch the place. Reed hesitated, then nodded. Be careful. I will. Nora saddled her horse and rode hard toward town, the cold air stinging her face. The sky was heavy with clouds, threatening more snow, and the wind cut through her coat like it wasn't there. She reached town just as the sun was starting to set, the buildings casting long shadows across the muddy street. The land office was closed, the courthouse dark. She tied her horse outside the general store and went inside. The clerk looked up from behind the counter. Help you? I'm looking for information about a warrant, territorial prosecutor's office. The clerk frowned. For what? Silas Drummond. The man's expression shifted, something wary sliding into place. Don't know anything about that. Are you sure? Because I said I don't know anything. He turned away, busying himself with a ledger. If you're not buying something, I'd appreciate it if you left. Nora felt frustration rise hot in her chest, but she forced it down. Fine. She walked out and stood on the boardwalk, looking up and down the street. A few people were out, hurrying through the cold, but no one met her eyes. The whole town felt tight, closed off, like everyone was waiting for something bad to happen. Nora was about to mount her horse when she saw him. Drummond, stepping out of the saloon across the street. He saw her at the same moment, and something like amusement crossed his face. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. Mrs. Calloway, he said, enjoying your evening? Nora kept her voice level. Just passing through. Funny, I heard you were looking for news about a warrant. Drummond smiled. Find what you were looking for. Nora's hands clenched. Not yet. That's too bad. Drummond stepped closer, lowering his voice. You want to know a secret? There is no warrant. Your prosecutor friend ran into some trouble with the judge. Seems the evidence you brought him wasn't as solid as he thought. Nora's heart stuttered. You're lying. Am I? Drummond's smile widened. Why don't you ride to Denver and find out? Of course, by the time you get there and back, your payment will be due, and I'll be waiting. He tipped his hat and walked away. Nora stood there, frozen, her mind racing. He was bluffing. He had to be bluffing. But what if he wasn't?
She mounted her horse and rode out of town faster than she'd come in, the cold air burning her lungs. By the time she reached the homestead, it was full dark, and Reed was waiting on the porch with the rifle. "What happened?" he asked as soon as she dismounted. Nora told him. Reed's face went hard. "He's lying, trying to shake you." "What if he's not?" "Then we ride to Denver tomorrow and find out." Reed grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "We don't give up now, not when we're this close." Nora nodded, but the fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest. They didn't sleep that night. They sat at the table, the lamp burning low, going over every possible scenario. If the warrant came through, they'd be safe. If it didn't, they had 5 days to come up with $200 they didn't have. "We could sell the cattle," Reed said. "We'd get maybe $80 for all of them. That's not enough." "Then we sell the land." Nora looked at him sharply. "To who? Drummond's the only buyer, and he's not going to pay us fairly." Reed ran his hands through his hair. "Then I don't know what we do." Nora stared at the table, her mind turning. There had to be something they were missing, some angle they hadn't considered, and then it hit her. "The other contracts," she said. Reed looked up. "What?" "The contracts Drummond holds on other properties. If we can prove those are fraudulent too, it strengthens the case. Makes it harder for the judge to ignore. We already gave Gorman everything we found. From Drummond's office. But what about the land office? Public records. If we can cross-reference the foreclosure dates with the contracts, prove he violated procedure on multiple properties." Reed was already standing. "The land office is closed until morning. Then we go first thing." They rode out at dawn, reaching town just as the land office was opening. The clerk, a different one than Nora had seen before, older with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his desk. "Can I help you?" "We need to see the foreclosure records for the past 3 years," Nora said. "Everything filed under Silas Drummond's name." The clerk studied them for a moment, then shrugged. "It's public record. Give me a minute." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a stack of ledgers. "These are all the foreclosures in the county. You'll have to sort through them yourself." They spread the ledgers across a table in the corner and started working. It took them 4 hours. 4 hours of cross-referencing dates, comparing contract terms, tracking down discrepancies. But by the time they were done, they had it. 11 properties where Drummond had foreclosed early. 11 cases where he'd violated the legal waiting period, taking land before the owners had a chance to make good on their debts. Nora stared at the list, her heart pounding. This is it. This is what Gorman needs. Reed looked at the papers, then at her. "We need to get this to Denver. Now." She said. They were packing up the ledgers when the door opened. Judge Horace Tinsley walked in. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His eyes swept the room and landed on Nora and Reed. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway," he said. "I heard you were asking questions." Nora's hand moved toward the papers, but she forced herself to stop. "Just doing research." "Is that what you call it?" Tinsley walked closer, his eyes on the ledgers. "Funny. It looks more like you're trying to build a case against one of my constituents." Reed stepped between Tinsley and the table. "We're not doing anything illegal." "Perhaps not, but you're wasting your time." Tinsley's voice was calm, almost friendly. "I've reviewed the evidence your prosecutor sent over. It's insufficient. The warrant request was denied." Nora felt the floor drop out from under her. "You can't do that." "I can, and I did. Mr. Drummond is a respected member of this community. I'm not going to authorize a warrant based on stolen documents and hearsay." "It's not hearsay," Nora said, her voice shaking. "It's proof. He's been stealing land for years and you've been helping him." Tinsley's expression didn't change. "Be very careful what you accuse me of, Mrs. Calloway." "Or what? You'll have us arrested?" "Go ahead. At least then someone might actually look at the evidence." Tinsley studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, cold and sharp. "You're very brave, or very foolish. I haven't decided which." He turned toward the door. "Either way, you've lost. The warrant is denied. The contracts stand. And in 4 days, Mr. Drummond will take possession of your land." He walked out. Nora stood there, shaking,
Her hands clenched into fists. Reed touched her arm. Nora He can't do this, she said. He can't just... He already did. Reed's voice was tight. We need to go. Now. They gathered the ledgers and walked out into the cold. Nora's mind was spinning, trying to find a way out, a solution, anything. But every path led to the same dead end. Tinsley had shut them down. The warrant was denied. In 4 days, they'd lose everything. They were halfway to their horses when a man stepped out of the alley. Samuel Gorman. He looked tired, his coat rumpled, his face drawn. I heard what happened. Then you know we're done, Reed said. Not yet. Gorman glanced around, then lowered his voice. Tinsley denied the warrant, but he doesn't have the final say. I can appeal to the territorial judge in Denver. If I can get there by tomorrow, present the new evidence you just found. Will it work? Nora asked. I don't know, but it's the only shot we have. Nora looked at Reed, then back at Gorman. What do you need? Everything you just found, the ledgers, the cross-references, all of it, and I need it today. Nora handed him the papers. How long until you know? 2 days? Maybe 3? We don't have 3 days. Then I'll make it 2. Gorman tucked the papers inside his coat. Go home. Protect your land. I'll send word as soon as I have an answer. He turned and walked away, moving fast. Nora watched him go, her chest tight. You think he can do it? Reed exhaled hard. I think we're about to find out. They rode back to the homestead in silence. The sky was dark, heavy with the promise of snow. The wind cut across the open ground, sharp and biting. By the time they reached the cabin, Nora's hands were numb inside her gloves. Reed built up the fire while Nora checked the cattle. They were huddled together, restless, sensing the storm coming. She counted them again, still 5, and spread out the last of Jacob's hay. Inside, Reed had coffee brewing. He poured her a cup and she wrapped her hands around it, trying to absorb the warmth. What do we do if Gorman doesn't come through it? She asked. Reed sat down across from her. We fight anyway. How? I don't know, but I'm not handing Drummond this land without making him work for it. Nora looked at him, at the set of his jaw, the determination in his eyes. This man who'd been ready to give up when she first arrived was now ready to fight to the end. She realized she loved him for it. The thought hit her so suddenly she almost said it out loud. But she didn't, because there wasn't time for that now. Maybe there never would be. Instead, she said, Then we make a stand. Reed nodded. Together. The storm hit that night, worse than the last one. Snow piled against the cabin walls, the wind howling like something alive. The temperature dropped so fast the water bucket froze solid in less than an hour. Nora and Reed took turns feeding the fire, making sure it didn't go out. Around midnight, Nora heard something over the wind. Horses. She grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, peering out through the gap in the shutter. 6 riders, moving slow through the snow toward the cabin. Reed, she said quietly. He was beside her in an instant. Drummond? Can't tell. They watched the riders approach, and as they got closer, Nora saw they weren't Drummond's men. It was Sarah Mackenzie, Beth Riley, and Tom Birch, along with 3 others Nora didn't recognize. Reed opened the door and they stumbled in, shaking snow from their coats. Sarah spoke first, her voice rough from the cold. We heard what happened, about the warrant. News travels fast, Reed said. It does when everyone's waiting to see if Drummond finally gets stopped. Sarah looked around at the others. We talked, all of us. And we decided if he's coming after you, he's coming after all of us, so we're here. Beth stepped forward. We're not letting him take this land without a fight. Tom nodded. You stood up when the rest of us were too scared. Now it's our turn. Nora felt something break open in her chest. You don't have to do this. Yes, we do, Sarah said. Because if you fall, we all fall, and I'm tired of falling. The others murmured agreement. Reed looked at Nora, then back at the group. All right, then we make a plan. They spent the rest of the night working it out. If Drummond came before Gorman's answer arrived, they'd be ready. They'd barricade the cabin, post lookouts, make it clear that taking the land would cost more than Drummond wanted to pay.
It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried under a foot of fresh snow. The group stayed through the next day, taking shifts watching the road, fortifying the cabin. Someone had brought food, bread, dried meat, a jar of preserves, and they shared it around the table like a family. Nora watched them, these people who'd been strangers a few months ago, now risking everything to stand with her and Reed. It felt impossible. It felt like hope. On the second day, a rider appeared on the horizon. Everyone went still. Reed grabbed the rifle. Positions. They spread out, Sarah and Tom at the windows, Beth by the door, the others outside watching the approaches. The rider came closer, and Nora's heart hammered in her chest. Then she saw the horse, recognized it. "It's Jacob," she said. Reed lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't put it down. Jacob rode up fast, his face flushed with cold and excitement. He dismounted before his horse stopped moving. "Gorman got the warrant," he said, breathless. "Judge in Denver signed it this morning. Drummond's assets are frozen. The contracts are void. It's over." Nora couldn't breathe. "You're sure?" Jacob pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to her. "This came through the telegraph office an hour ago. I rode straight here." Nora unfolded it, her hands shaking. The words blurred, but the meaning was clear. Warrant issued, Drummond arrested. All contracts under review. Property seizures suspended pending investigation. She looked up at Reed, and the expression on his face mirrored what she felt. Disbelief, relief, something too big to name. "We did it," she said. Reed's voice cracked. "We did it!" The cabin erupted. Sarah laughed, loud and unrestrained. Beth grabbed Tom and hugged him. The others were shouting, clapping each other on the back. And for a moment it was chaos, beautiful, messy, human chaos. Nora stood in the middle of it, the warrant still clutched in her hand, and felt tears streaming down her face. Reed pulled her into his arms, and she held on tight, her face pressed against his shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough, "for not giving up, for making me believe." Nora pulled back just enough to look at him. "We did this together." Reed smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him since the day they met. "Yeah, we did." The celebration went on through the afternoon. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey that got passed around until it was empty. Sarah told stories about the old days, before Drummond, when the valley was just starting and everyone helped everyone. Tom played a harmonica he'd brought, badly, and no one cared. Nora sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset over the snow-covered land, and felt something settle in her chest. Peace. She'd been running her whole life, from her father's death, from her uncle's house, from the idea that she'd never have a place that was truly hers. But this place, this broken-down homestead in the middle of nowhere, had become exactly that. Reed came out and sat beside her. "You all right?" "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" "About how different things could have been if I'd given up that first week." Reed was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you didn't." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. Inside, the laughter continued, warm and alive. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Nora let herself just be happy. The next morning, Nora woke to the sound of hammering. She sat up, disoriented, and realized she was alone in the cabin. The fire was still burning, someone had kept it fed through the night, and through the window she could see figures moving in the yard. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside into air so cold it burned her lungs. Sarah Mackenzie was on a ladder, nailing boards onto what was left of the barn frame. Tom Birch and two other men were hauling charred timber away from the foundation. Beth Riley was organizing salvaged materials into piles. Good wood here, scrap there, nails in a bucket. Reed looked up from where he was measuring a beam and saw Nora standing on the porch. "Figured we'd get started," he said. "Started on what?" "The barn. Can't run cattle without shelter." He gestured to the others. Everyone wanted to help. Nora felt her throat tighten. "You don't have to do this," Sarah called down from the ladder. "Course we don't, but we're doing it anyway." Tom straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "You stood up for all of us. Least we can do is help you rebuild." Nora looked around at their faces, tired, determined, alive with something that looked like purpose. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and picked up a hammer. They worked through the day. It was slow, hard labor, clearing the site, measuring twice before cutting, arguing over the best way to frame the walls. Nobody really knew what they were doing. Tom had built a chicken coop once. Sarah remembered watching her husband raise a shed 20 years ago. Reed had worked construction as a kid but couldn't remember half of it. But they figured it out as they went. By nightfall, they had the foundation cleared and the first corner post set. It wasn't much, but looking at it, solid and straight in the frozen ground, felt like something. They gathered around a fire outside the cabin, passing around coffee and the last of the bread. The conversation was loose, easy. Stories about bad winters and worse harvests, arguments about the best way to cure bacon, laughter at Tom's terrible jokes. Nora sat next to Reed, her shoulder pressed against his, and watched the fire. "You ever think we'd actually get here?" she asked quietly. Reed took a drink of coffee. "No, honestly thought we'd lose everything." "What changed?" He looked at her. "You did. You showed up and refused to accept that losing was inevitable. Made me remember what fighting looked like." Nora felt something warm spread through her chest. "I couldn't have done it alone." "Neither could I." Reed's hand found hers. "We make a good team." "Yeah," Nora said. "We do." The work continued over the next week, slower than any of them wanted, but steady. More people from the valley showed up. Some Nora recognized, others she'd never met. A man named Henry Caldwell, who'd lost his land to Drummond 5 years ago and moved to the next county, brought lumber he'd milled himself. A woman named Margaret Torres, whose husband had been one of Drummond's victims, arrived with her 3 sons, and they worked for 2 days straight without asking for anything in return. Every hammer strike felt like an act of defiance. Every board nailed into place was proof that Drummond hadn't won. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered. 3 days later, Samuel Gorman came to the homestead. He arrived in a hired wagon, dressed in his usual suit but looking more relaxed than Nora had ever seen him. He stepped down and surveyed the partially rebuilt barn with approval. "Making progress," he said. Reed wiped his hands on his pants. "Trying to. What brings you out here?" Gorman reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. "Wanted to deliver this in person. The investigation into Drummond's operations is complete. All 11 fraudulent foreclosures have been overturned. The land is being returned to the original owners." Nora felt her breath catch. "All of it?" "All of it, including 2 properties where the owners had already died. Those are being transferred to their heirs." Gorman opened the folder and pulled out a document. "This is yours. Clear title. No debt, no liens, no strings attached." Reed took the paper, his hand shaking slightly. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Nora. "It's really ours," he said. "It's really yours," Gorman confirmed. Drummond's assets have been seized to cover restitution payments. Judge Tinsley has been removed from the bench pending a corruption investigation. And Drummond himself is looking at 10 to 15 years in territorial prison. Nora sat down hard on a stack of lumber. "What about the others? The people who lost their land years ago? We're tracking down as many as we can. Some have moved on, started over elsewhere. We'll try to compensate them, but it's complicated." Gorman's expression sobered. "Justice doesn't always mean everything gets fixed. Sometimes it just means the bleeding stops." Reed folded the deed carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "Thank you for everything." Gorman shook his hand. "You two did the hard part. I just filed the paperwork." He glanced at Nora. "Though, if you ever get tired of ranching, Mrs. Calloway, you'd make a hell of an investigator." Nora smiled faintly. "I'll keep that in mind." Gorman climbed back into the wagon. "Good luck with the barn, and with everything else." They watched him drive away. Reed pulled the deed back out and stared at it like he needed to keep checking to make sure it was real. "We should celebrate," Nora said. "We don't have anything to celebrate with." "We have each other. That's enough." Reed looked at her and something shifted in his expression, something soft and unguarded. "Yeah, it is." After Gorman left, Nora walked out to the edge of the property, past the corral where the cattle stood chewing their hay, past the garden plot that would need tilling come spring, all the way to the fence line that marked the boundary of what was now, legally and finally, theirs. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the mountains in the distance, the valley spreading wide and endless before her. A year ago, she'd been nobody, a burden her uncle couldn't wait to be rid of, a woman sent to die on a failing homestead because it was easier than dealing with her. Now she was someone who'd broken into a rich man's house and stolen the evidence that brought him down. Someone who'd ridden through blizzards and fires and threats and kept going anyway. Someone who'd learned that the difference between winning and losing sometimes came down to nothing more than refusing to quit when quitting made sense. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Reed walking toward her, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "You all right out here?" he asked. "Just thinking." "About what?" Nora gestured to the land around them. "About how different everything is now. How it almost didn't turn out this way." Reed came to stand beside her.
"But it did." "Yeah, it did." She was quiet for a moment. "You know what scares me?" "What?" "That I'll wake up one day and this'll all be gone. That it was too easy. That we missed something. That Drummond will find a way to take it all back." Reed put his arm around her shoulders. "He can't. The law's on our side now. The deed's in our name. He's in prison and staying there." "I know, but I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "Maybe it won't. Maybe we actually won." Reed pulled her closer. "Maybe we get to just live now." Nora leaned into him, letting his warmth seep into her bones. "I don't know if I remember how to do that. Just live without fighting for survival. Then we'll learn together." The barn took another 2 weeks to finish. More people from the valley showed up to help, folks who'd heard what happened and wanted to be part of something good for once. Some brought materials, others brought labor. A few just brought food and stayed to watch, but even that felt like support. By the time they nailed the last board into place and hung the door, it was early January. The new barn wasn't as big as the old one, but it was sturdy, solid, built by hand with help from people who'd become something like family. They held a barn-raising celebration that night. Nothing fancy, just everyone gathered in the yard with whatever food they'd brought, sharing stories and warmth. Beth Riley stood on a crate and raised a tin cup of cider. To Nora and Reed Calloway, for reminding us what it means to fight back. Everyone raised their cups and drank. Sarah Mackenzie went next. To all of us, for proving that Drummond didn't break us. More cheers. Tom Birch, already half drunk, climbed onto the crate after Sarah stepped down. To new beginnings, and old friends, and barns that don't fall down. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nora stood at the edge of it all, watching, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. Reed came up beside her. "You all right?" "Better than all right." She looked up at him. "I was just thinking about the day I got here, how much I hated this place, how sure I was that it would break me. And now? Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Reed's hand found the small of her back. "I'm glad you stayed." "Me too." They stood there together, and the noise of the celebration faded into something warm and distant. After a moment, Reed said, "I've been thinking. About what? About us. About what comes next." He turned to face her fully. "When you first got here, this was just a transaction, a way for both of us to survive. But somewhere along the way, it became something more." Nora's heart was beating faster. "Reed, I'm not good with words, Nora. Never have been. But I need you to know that I—" He stopped, frustrated, then tried again. "What I'm trying to say is that I love you, and I want this to be real. Not just a marriage on paper, but a real partnership, a real life." Nora felt tears prick her eyes. "It already is real. I know, but I wanted to say it. Wanted you to hear it." Reed took her hand. "So, what do you say? You want to build a life with me? A real one?" Nora smiled, her vision blurring. "I already am." Reed pulled her into his arms, and she held on tight, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness. Around them, the celebration continued, but in that moment, it was just the two of them, standing on land that was finally, truly theirs. The winter that followed was hard, but they were ready for it. The cattle stayed healthy in the new barn.
The hay they'd stockpiled lasted through February. When the snow got too deep to move around easily, they stayed inside and planned for spring. What crops to plant, how many head of cattle to breed, whether to expand the corral or fix the cabin roof first. It felt good, planning for a future that wasn't just about survival. In late February, Jacob Lowe came by with news that Drummond's trial had concluded. Guilty on all charges. 15 years in territorial prison with no possibility of early release. "How's he taking it?" Reed asked. Jacob shrugged. "About like you'd expect, and angry, blaming everyone but himself." He paused. His lawyer tried to argue that the contracts were legal and he was just conducting business. Judge shut that down fast. Said stealing is stealing, no matter how many papers you hide it behind. Nora felt a grim satisfaction. "Good." "There's more," Jacob said. "The territorial governor's office is launching a full investigation into land fraud across Colorado. They're using your case as the model, looking into other schemes like Drummond's." Reed's eyebrows went up. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. What you two did, it's bigger than just this valley. You showed that regular people can fight back against corruption and win. That matters." After Jacob left, Nora and Reed stood in the yard, looking at the mountains in the distance. "You think Drummond will cause trouble when he gets out?" Nora asked. "Maybe, but that's 15 years from now. A lot can change in 15 years. Nora thought about how much had changed in just 6 months. "Yeah, I suppose it can." Spring came slowly, but it came. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would turn green soon. The creek swelled with runoff. Birds returned, filling the morning with sound. Nora planted a garden, vegetables mostly, but also wildflowers along the edge because she wanted something beautiful to look at. Reed mended the last of the fences and bought 2 more head of cattle from a rancher up north who'd heard about what they'd done and offered a fair price out of respect. The homestead started to look like a real working ranch instead of a place barely clinging to life. In April, Beth Riley got married to a man from town, a quiet, steady fellow named Daniel who'd been courting her all winter. The wedding was small, held in the church with a reception afterward at the boarding house. Nora and Reed attended, and watching Beth's face as she said her vows, Nora felt a pang of something bittersweet. On the ride home, Reed asked, "You ever think about that? A real wedding, I mean." "We're already married." "I know, but we never had a ceremony, never had a chance to choose each other in front of people who matter." Nora thought about it. "You want that?" "I don't need it, but I think I'd like it." Reed glanced at her. "What about you?" Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like it too." They were married again on a Saturday in May. Not in a church this time, but in the yard of the homestead, surrounded by the people who'd stood with them when everything was falling apart. Sarah Mackenzie officiated, reading from a book of poems someone had brought. Beth and Daniel stood as witnesses, along with Tom and Jacob. It wasn't fancy. Nora wore the same dress she'd worn to Beth's wedding, borrowed from Sarah and altered to fit. Reed wore his cleanest shirt and the only pair of pants without holes. But when Sarah asked if they chose each other, freely and without reservation, and they both said yes, it felt like the most important thing either of them had ever done. Afterward, there was food and music and dancing in the yard. Someone had brought a fiddle, and the music was terrible but joyful. Nora danced with Reed, his hand warm against her back, and for once she wasn't thinking about what came next or what could go wrong. She was just happy. Later in the evening, as the sun was setting and people were starting to head home, Sarah pulled Nora aside. "I wanted to give you something," Sarah said. She handed Nora a small wooden box worn smooth with age. Nora opened it. Inside was a silver locket on a chain. "It was my mother's," Sarah said. "Been in my family for 3 generations. I don't have children to pass it to, and I'd like you to have it." Nora's throat tightened. "Sarah, I can't." "Yes, you can. You remind me of her, actually. My mother. She was stubborn as hell, didn't take no for an answer, built a life out of nothing in a place that tried to kill her every winter." Sarah smiled. "She would have liked you." Nora hugged her, holding tight. "Thank you." That night, after everyone had gone home and the yard was quiet again, Reed and Nora sat on the porch and watched the stars. "You think we'll make it?" Reed asked. "Long term, I mean. Through all the hard years that are coming. Nora leaned against him. I think we've already been through the hardest part. Everything else is just weather. Reed laughed. Just weather. I like that. Besides, Nora said, we've got something Drummond never had. What's that? People who actually give a damn whether we succeed or fail. Reed squeezed her hand. Yeah, we do. They sat in comfortable silence, and Nora thought about the woman who'd stepped off that wagon 7 months ago, angry, scared, convinced she'd been sent somewhere to die. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd learned that home wasn't a place you were given, but something you built with your own hands and defended with everything you had. Summer brought its own challenges. A drought in June that had everyone worried until the rains finally came in July. A fence break that scattered cattle halfway across the valley and took 3 days to round up. A rattlesnake in the garden that nearly bit Nora before Reed killed it with a shovel. But there were good things too. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, so they traded the surplus in town for supplies. The cattle bred successfully, and by August they had 3 new calves. The cabin roof got fixed, and Reed built a second room so they'd have more space when winter came again. In late summer, a reporter from Denver came to interview them. His name was William Crane, young and eager, with a notebook he scribbled in constantly. He'd heard about the Drummond case and wanted to write a story about it for the territorial newspaper. People need to know what happened here, he said, sitting at their kitchen table. They need to know that the system can work if you fight hard enough. Nora wasn't sure about that. The system nearly didn't work. We almost lost everything. But you didn't. And now Drummond's in prison and other investigations are happening across the territory. That's because of you. It's because of a lot of people, Reed corrected. We didn't do this alone. Crane interviewed them for hours, asking about everything. How they discovered the fraud, the break-in, the witnesses, the trial. He talked to Sarah and Tom and Jacob too, getting their perspectives. The article ran 2 weeks later, front page of the Denver Territorial News. Frontier Justice. How 2 homesteaders brought down a land baron. Nora read it sitting on the porch, her coffee going cold in her hand. Crane had gotten most of it right, though he'd made them sound more heroic than they felt. He'd quoted Sarah saying, "They showed us what courage looks like," and Tom saying, "They gave us back our dignity." Reed read over her shoulder. "Think anyone will actually care?" "I don't know. Maybe." 3 days later, they got their answer. Letters started arriving, dozens of them, from people across Colorado and beyond, ranchers dealing with similar schemes, families who'd lost land to predatory contracts, lawyers asking for details to help build their own cases. One letter was from a woman in Wyoming whose husband had hanged himself after losing their ranch to a scheme almost identical to Drummond's. She wrote, "I thought we were alone, thought there was no point in fighting, but reading about what you did gave me hope that maybe justice is possible. I've contacted a lawyer. We're going to try." Nora read that letter 3 times, her hands shaking. This was what Sarah had meant, about how standing up for yourself also meant standing up for people you'd never meet, about how one act of defiance could ripple outward in ways you'd never see. In September, Sarah Mackenzie fell ill. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away and turned into something worse. Nora visited every few days, bringing soup and sitting with Sarah when the fever got bad. One evening, Sarah grabbed Nora's hand and held it tight. "I'm not going to make it through this one," she said, her voice weak. "Don't talk like that." "It's true, and you know it." Sarah managed a small smile. "I'm not scared. I've lived a long time, seen a lot, lost more than I can count. But these past few months, being part of something that mattered again, that was a gift." Nora's throat tightened. "You gave us a gift too. We wouldn't have made it without you." "You would have. You're tougher than you think." Sarah's grip tightened. "Promise me something. Anything. Don't let this place make you hard. Don't let survival be the only thing you live for. Find joy where you can. Love who you can. That's what makes it all worth it." Nora nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise." Sarah died 2 days later, in her sleep, peacefully. They buried her on her own land under a cottonwood tree she'd planted with her first husband 40 years ago. Half the valley came to the funeral, and Tom played his harmonica, better this time, like Sarah deserved. Beth read a poem about resilience and hope. Jacob spoke about how Sarah had been the first person to believe Drummond could be beaten. Reed thanked her for teaching them both what real strength looked like. Nora couldn't speak. She stood by the grave with tears running down her face, clutching the locket Sarah had given her, and thought about everything the woman had meant to them. Afterward, Nora and Reed stood by the grave alone, and Nora said quietly, "She was right, about not letting this life make us hard." "Yeah," Reed agreed. "She usually was." "I want to do that," Nora said. "I want to make sure we're not just surviving, that we're actually living." Reed nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." They started small. Sunday dinners with whoever wanted to come: Tom, Beth, and Daniel, Jacob, other neighbors from the valley. Evenings on the porch, just talking. Not about work or money, but about books they'd read or places they wanted to see someday. Nora started keeping a journal, writing down the things she was grateful for each day. Some days it was hard to find anything. Other days the list was longer than she expected. Reed learned to play the fiddle, badly at first, then slightly less badly. He'd sit on the porch in the evenings and practice, and Nora would listen, amused and charmed by his determination. In October, they took a trip to Denver, not for legal reasons this time, just to see the city. They stayed in a hotel with actual beds and ate dinner in a restaurant where someone else did the cooking. They walked through stores and looked at things they couldn't afford, and it didn't matter because they weren't there to buy anything. They were just there to be together, away from the homestead and the constant work. And it felt like a kind of freedom Nora hadn't known existed. On the train ride back, Reed said, "We should do this every year." "What, take a trip?" "Yeah, just a few days. Remind ourselves there's a world outside the ranch." Nora leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'd like that." Winter came again, their second one together, and it was easier than the first. They had enough hay, enough firewood, enough money saved that they didn't have to worry about making it through. The cattle were healthy, and the barn was solid, and the cabin was warm. On Christmas Eve, they invited everyone over: Tom, Beth, and Daniel, Jacob, a few other families from the valley. They roasted a chicken and made biscuits, and someone brought pie. It wasn't fancy, but sitting around the table with these people, laughing and telling stories and just being together, Nora felt something she'd never felt before. Family. Not the family you were born into, but the one you chose. The one you built from nothing, in a place that tried to break you. By the time their first anniversary came around, not the paper marriage in the judge's office, but the real one in the yard. Nora felt like a different person. Not because the work had gotten easier or the land had gotten kinder, but because she'd learned something important. You didn't have to wait for life to get easy before you started living it. They marked the anniversary quietly, just the two of them. Reed cooked dinner, burned the meat a little, but Nora didn't care. They sat at the table they'd built together in a cabin they'd made into a home and talked about everything and nothing. "You happy?" Reed asked at one point. Nora thought about it. "Yeah, I am. Are you?" "More than I ever thought I'd be." "Even with all the hard parts?" "Especially with the hard parts. They're what make the good parts mean something." Nora smiled. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just paying attention." Later, lying in bed with Reed's arm around her and the sound of wind against the cabin walls, Nora thought about the question she'd asked herself that first night. Could she survive here? The answer had been yes, but that was the wrong question. The right question was, could she build a life here? And the answer to that was also yes. Not because it was easy or comfortable or anything like what she'd imagined, but because she'd chosen it, because she'd fought for it, because she'd refused to let circumstances define who she became. 2 years after Nora first arrived, Jacob Lowe stopped by with news. "Drummond's appealing his sentence," he said. "Says the trial was unfair, that Gorman fabricated evidence." Reed's jaw tightened. "Can he do that?" "He can try. Probably won't get anywhere. The evidence was solid and there were too many witnesses. But he's going to drag it out as long as he can." Nora felt a flicker of the old fear, but it faded quickly. "Let him try. We're not going anywhere." Jacob smiled. "No, I don't suppose you are." After he left, Reed asked, "You really not worried?" "I'm worried," Nora admitted, "but I'm not scared. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Scared means you think you're going to lose. Worried means you're prepared to fight if you have to."
She looked at the land around them, at everything they'd built. We've fought before. We can do it again if we need to. Reed nodded. Yeah.
We can. Drummond's appeal was denied 6 months later. The ruling came through in a letter from Gorman, brief and to the point. The appellate judge had found no grounds for a new trial. The original sentence stood. Nora read the letter twice, then folded it and tucked it away in the drawer where she kept the deed to the land. That night, she and Reed stood in the yard and looked at the stars, the same way they had a dozen times before. You think we'll ever stop waiting for the other shoe to drop? Reed asked. Maybe. Someday. Nora slipped her hand into his. But until then, we just keep building. Building what? Everything. The ranch, the life, the future. All of it. Reed pulled her close, and they stood there together, two people who'd been strangers once, who'd been broken and scared and barely holding on. But not anymore. Now they were something different, something stronger. They were home. 3 years after that first wagon ride, Nora stood in the yard of the homestead and watched the sun rise over the mountains. The ranch had grown. They had 20 head of cattle now, a chicken coop, a second barn for hay storage. The garden was bigger, more organized, producing enough that they sold vegetables at the market in town every week. The cabin had been expanded too. 2 more rooms, a proper kitchen, windows that actually fit their frames. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, built to last. In the distance, Nora could see Reed mending a fence post, his movements efficient and practiced. He looked up and saw her watching, and even from here she could see him smile. She smiled back. This life hadn't turned out anything like she'd expected when her uncle had traded her away like livestock. It had been harder, messier, more painful than anything she could have imagined, but it had also been more meaningful. She'd learned things here that she never would have learned anywhere else. That strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about how you put yourself back together afterward. That home wasn't something you were given, but something you fought for and built with your own hands. That love wasn't about perfection or ease, but about choosing someone every day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. In the spring of their 4th year, Nora found out she was pregnant. The news terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. Reed was so excited he couldn't sit still, pacing the cabin and making plans they didn't need yet. We'll need to build a crib, he said, and we should expand the cabin again, add another room for the baby. Reed, I'm only 2 months along. We have time. I know, He stopped, his face suddenly vulnerable. I want to do this right. Nora took his hand. We will, together. The pregnancy was hard. Nora was sick most mornings through the first trimester, and the work on the ranch didn't stop just because she was carrying a child. But Beth came by regularly to help, and Tom and Jacob pitched in with the heavier work Reed couldn't manage alone. The valley had become that kind of place, where people showed up for each other without being asked. The baby was born in early March, on a day when the wind was screaming and snow was coming down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet. The doctor couldn't make it from town, so Beth and a midwife named Clara Harrison delivered the baby while Reed paced outside like he was trying to wear a path in the frozen ground. It was a girl. She came into the world screaming, red-faced and angry, and when Clara placed her in Nora's arms, Nora felt something shift in her chest that she'd never felt before. This tiny person, this fragile, perfect thing, was hers. Hers to protect and raise and teach about the world. The responsibility of it was terrifying. Reed came in, his face pale, and looked down at his daughter. She's perfect, he said, his voice breaking. She's loud, Nora said, but she was smiling. They named her Sarah, after the woman who'd taught them both what it meant to stand up and fight. Sarah Calloway grew fast. By 6 months, she was crawling, getting into everything, pulling herself up on furniture and laughing when she fell. By a year, she was walking, toddling around the yard with Reed following close behind to make sure she didn't hurt herself. Watching Reed with their daughter did something to Nora. This man who'd been so closed off when she first arrived, so convinced he had to do everything alone, was now gentle and patient in ways she hadn't known he could be. One evening, she found him sitting on the porch with Sarah in his lap, pointing out the stars and making up stories about them. That one there? That's the wandering bear, he was saying. He got lost looking for honey and ended up in the sky. Sarah babbled something incomprehensible, and Reed nodded seriously, like she'd said something profound. Nora leaned against the doorframe, watching them, and thought about how far they'd come. 5 years after Nora first arrived, the homestead was unrecognizable from what it had been. The land was productive, the cattle healthy, the buildings solid. They'd paid off every debt, saved enough to weather bad years, built relationships with neighbors that went beyond mere survival. Tom Birch had taken over Sarah Mackenzie's land, running it with the same stubborn determination she'd shown. Beth and Daniel had started a family, twin boys who were terrors and a delight in equal measure. Jacob had left Drummond's old office and opened his own accounting practice in town, helping other ranchers avoid the kind of predatory contracts that had nearly destroyed them all. The valley had healed, slowly but surely, and so had Nora. She still had days when the old fear crept back in, when she waited for everything to fall apart again. But those days were fewer now, and easier to talk herself through. Because she'd learned the most important lesson of all, that survival was just the beginning, that the real work, the real life, was what you built after you'd survived. One autumn evening, Nora sat on the porch with Sarah asleep in her arms and Reed beside her, and watched the sun set over land that was finally, completely, irrevocably theirs. "You ever think about that first day?" Reed asked. "When you stepped off the wagon and saw this place?" "Sometimes." "What do you think about?" Nora looked at the cabin, the barn, the fence line stretching toward the horizon. "I think about how sure I was that it would break me, how certain I was that I'd fail. And now? Now I know I was wrong. It didn't break me. It made me." Reed's hand found hers. It made both of us. They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded, and Nora thought about all the things she'd learned. That the hardest battles were often the ones you had to fight just to claim the right to exist on your own terms. That justice didn't always come easy or fast, but it could come if you were willing to fight for it. That home wasn't about the place. It was about the people you chose to stand with when everything fell apart. And most importantly, that you didn't have to be perfect to deserve a life worth living. You just had to be willing to fight for it. The story could have ended differently. Nora knew that. There were 1,000 ways it could have gone wrong. 1,000 moments where one different choice would have meant total collapse. But it hadn't gone wrong. They'd won. Not because they were special or chosen or destined for anything, but because when it mattered most, they'd refused to quit. They'd refused to accept that losing was inevitable. They'd looked at a system designed to crush them and decided to fight back anyway. And that refusal, that stubborn, relentless refusal to break, had made all the difference. Years passed. Sarah grew into a strong-willed, sharp-eyed girl who could ride a horse by the time she was 5 and knew how to mend a fence by 7. They had another child, a boy they named Thomas after Tom Birch, who'd become something like an uncle to their family. The ranch continued to grow. They hired help eventually. Young men from town who needed work, families displaced by drought in other parts of the territory. Nora and Reed treated them fairly, paid them well, and some stayed on for years. The valley prospered. New families moved in, drawn by stories of land that couldn't be stolen by corrupt men with fancy contracts. A school opened in town. A proper doctor set up practice. Life got a little easier, though it never stopped being hard. Tom Birch died in his sleep at 73, and they buried him next to Sarah Mackenzie under the cottonwood tree. Beth and Daniel moved to Denver so their boys could go to university, but they visited every summer. Jacob married a schoolteacher named Ellen, and they had 4 children who ran wild through the valley every chance they got. The world changed. Colorado became a state. New laws were passed to prevent the kind of land fraud Drummond had perpetrated. Samuel Gorman became a judge himself, known for his fairness and his refusal to bend to pressure from powerful men. And through it all, Nora and Reed kept building. On their 20th anniversary, they threw a party. Everyone came, people they'd known for years and some they'd just met, families who'd settled in the valley and travelers passing through who'd heard the story and wanted to see the place where it had happened. Someone brought a photographer, and he took a picture of Nora and Reed standing in front of the house they'd built together. In the photo, they're holding hands, both of them gray-haired now, faces lined with years of sun and work. Behind them, you can see the barn, the garden, the mountains in the distance. They look tired. They look proud. They look happy. That photograph would hang in the Calloway family home for generations. And when people asked about it, when children and grandchildren wanted to know the story, someone would always tell it. About the woman who was sent to die on a dying ranch and refused. About the man who'd given up and learned to fight again. About the community that came together to bring down a tyrant. About the lesson that survival is never just about making it through. It's about what you build once you've survived. On a spring morning, 30 years after Nora first arrived, she woke early and walked out to the fence line alone. She was 70 now, her body aching in ways it never had when she was young, but her mind was still sharp. Reed was still asleep in the house, and she'd left him there, wanting this moment to herself. She stood at the spot where she'd stood that first week, when she'd looked out at the valley and wondered if she'd survive. The land looked different now, greener, more lived in, dotted with buildings and fences and signs of human life. But the mountains were the same, and the sky, and the wind that never stopped blowing. Nora thought about everything that had happened. The fear and the fighting and the moments when she'd been sure they'd lose. The small victories that added up to something bigger. The people who'd stood with them and the ones who hadn't. The price of justice and the weight of responsibility and the strange, unexpected joy that came from building something worth keeping. She thought about Sarah Mackenzie, long dead, and the promise she'd made. About finding joy. About not letting this life make her hard. She'd tried. Some days she'd succeeded better than others. But she'd tried. And in the end, maybe that was all anyone could do. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Reed coming to find her. He came to stand beside her, saying nothing, just being there the way he'd been there for 30 years. "You all right?" he asked finally. "Yeah," Nora said, "just remembering." "Remembering what?" "Everything. All of it." She looked at him. "You ever regret it? Marrying me, fighting Drummond, all of it?" Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Not once." "Even the hard parts?" "Especially the hard parts." He took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis. They're what made it matter. Nora nodded, and they stood there together as the sun rose over the valley, over the life they'd built from nothing, over land that was finally and forever theirs. This was the lesson, Nora thought, the one she'd want her children and grandchildren to know. That you didn't need to be fearless to be brave. That you didn't need to win every battle to win the war. That home wasn't something you found. It was something you created, piece by piece, day by day, with your own hands and your own will and the help of people who believed in the same things you did. That survival was never the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And what you did after you survived, that was what defined you. As the years rolled on and Nora grew older, she watched her children grow into people she was proud of. Sarah took over running the ranch, fierce and competent, with her mother's stubbornness and her father's steady hands. Thomas became a lawyer, dedicating his career to helping small landowners fight against exploitation. The homestead remained in the family. Through droughts and depressions, through wars and peace, through good years and bad, the Calloways held on to the land that Nora and Reed had fought so hard to keep, and every generation learned the story. About the woman who refused to break, about the man who learned to fight again, about the truth that sometimes, when the system is rigged against you, the only option is to fight back with everything you have. About the lesson that your worth isn't determined by what others think of you, but by what you're willing to fight for when everything is on the line. Nora Calloway died in her sleep at 78, with Reed holding her hand and her children gathered around her bed. They buried her on the homestead, on a hill overlooking the valley, where she could see the mountains she'd stared at for so many years. The headstone was simple. Nora Calloway, 1847 to 1925. She refused to break. And that, more than anything else, was the truth of her life. She'd been sent to die, and instead she'd built something that lasted. She'd been treated like she didn't matter, and she'd proven that she did. She'd been told the fight was hopeless, and she'd won anyway. Not because she was special, not because she was chosen, but because she'd made a choice every single day to keep going when it would have been easier to quit. And in the end, that choice, that stubborn, relentless, beautiful choice, had changed everything.